Thank you, Alberto. So my first test to pass is whether I can share my screen. Just bear with me. Okay, so hopefully you can see that. Thank you very much for the invitation to talk to you this morning. My name is Terence Hogart. I'm a professor at the University of Warwick in the UK, but also a member of the Fondazione Brodolini Scientific Committee, and a lot of my research is conducted with the Fondazione. What I'd like to do this morning is just explore the idea of green jobs and green skills to try and identify what is it that we really need to know, because it's clear that if we're to achieve the green transition, if we're to achieve the ambitions that the European Commission have set, then there will be a requirement for people to be skilled with the appropriate competences to meet that ambition. Otherwise, there's every possibility, every probability that achieving the ambition will be slowed, or it'll be a lot more difficult to achieve than it otherwise might be. So there's a key role for skills anticipation to be able to identify the particular skills that are needed in the future. And what I'd like to do is just reflect on research I've been involved with over the past 15 years, try and identify where there may be occasionally wrong turns, and what is it that we know today that seems to work relatively well in being able to identify green jobs and green skills, and what is it that we need to invest in more in the future. To start off with, I think there's often a tendency sometimes in the discourse on greening, however you want to describe that there's the potential to create a lot of jobs, that it's going to be transformative, not only in changing the way we do our work, but actually in creating a lot more jobs. And I'm not sure that is actually proved by the research evidence that's out there. I think a lot of the evidence suggests, and if you look at studies which just look at gross effects, and of course, you observe quite large employment gains from various policy initiatives and shifts to more sustainable practices. But I think where you're looking at the net effect, it's not always necessarily the case that you see these employment gains. On average, I would say that you see very little change in overall employment levels from engaging in a variety of green initiatives. And I think that's a rather positive outcome, because it demonstrates that, by and large, that where you want to make this green transition, it doesn't have negative effects. But I think a lot of these studies are conducted at a European level or a national level, and where they're using sophisticated macroeconomic models to be able to identify the employment effects. Sometimes they do miss out on some very specific sector effects. But clearly, there are key sectors in the European economy that will drive forward the green transition, and there are some specific employment and skill effects one would expect to see there. And often there are some very localized regional local effects. And if you're looking at the production of wind turbines producing wind energy, often that's located in specific coastal locations. So the devil is in the detail, as it always is. Now, one of the things that we're very keen to identify is green jobs. And I think by and large, this has proven very difficult to do. And when I say we want to identify green jobs, we want to identify jobs that are almost wholly taken up with issues to do with sustainability, circularity, and so on and so forth. And I think there's a question as to whether those types of jobs exist in any great number. There have been attempts to come up with classifications of green jobs. The classic one was by Deardorff for ONET in the USA, which developed its own classification. And I think the results for that demonstrate that it's not so much that you create new specific green jobs. In actual fact, what you observe is existing jobs are changed to differing degrees. So no matter what line of work you're involved in, to a greater or lesser extent, you are going to have to obtain some, for want of a better expression, green competences, both now and increasingly so in the future, which then sort of begs the question, well, what are those green competences? But just to go back to the attempts to classify green jobs, I think there's also a tendency to try and come up with jobs which are identified jobs which are really sophisticated, very attractive to potentially to job seekers. But I would just point out that there was a very interesting study undertaken in the USA that adopted a very rigorous method, was very well resourced, and it was trying to identify what are the green jobs which are most important to the US economy. And after they'd conducted all their analysis, very sophisticated analysis, the job that was key to green economy, key to environmental sustainability, was that of bus drivers, which very well may be true, but I think it wasn't necessarily the finding they were looking for. I think they were much more interested in a whole range of much more sophisticated jobs than that. But anyway, if we look at the evidence, it's not so much about green jobs per se, but in actual fact, what are the different combinations of green skills that will be required across a very wide range of jobs in the future. And there have been some interesting developments here, and I'll just draw your attention to the green competences framework that the Joint Research Council and the European Commission has produced, which I think is a particularly interesting piece of work. It's essentially the product of a skills foresight type activity. And I think it produces some very interesting results. But you can see here that the focus is very much on generic skills rather than technical ones. So we see a wide range of general skills, and I think there's always a question here when you're looking at these types of skill: is actually, are some of them skills? In many respects, sometimes you're looking at personal attributes rather than skills specifically, which obviously then raises a whole set of issues about, well, how do you actually equip people with that particular type of, for want of a better expression, competence, when it really isn't a competence, it's a personal attribute. So I'm not trying to denigrate these approaches which focus on generic skills. I think they're very important because they clearly do affect all jobs. But I do think sometimes we do need that critical perspective of whether sometimes we're looking at skills or we're looking at something else, because that really has very important implications for education and skills policy. So what is it that we need to do more of? What is it that we need to do more of in the future if we want to engage in systematic skills anticipation, which will provide policymakers, education and training providers with the type of information they can use to develop a range of training interventions, programs, courses, or whatever. And I think to do that, you need to have a good understanding not only of the generic skills, but some of the key technical skills, which can be transversal as well, crisscrossing a range of occupations. But it's often those technical skills which are critical to achieving the green ambition, those that are set out in the European Green Deal. But there's a lot less attention, I think, focused on being able to identify those for understandable reasons. They're often very difficult to pinpoint. But nonetheless, if we want education and training providers to respond, then we need to have a good idea of what are the emerging technical skills alongside the generic ones that need to be supplied in the future. And whereas in the past, where technical change perhaps wasn't quite so rapid, perhaps that wasn't such a challenge, but now where technological change is rapid, and also there's a lot more regulatory change, then perhaps we need to focus research more on that. And a lot of the research in this area is often sort of atheoretical. There's a lot of big data analysis around, which it's very interesting, and it's often extraordinarily useful, but often it's not within what social scientists would consider to be a sort of theoretical conceptual framework, which is related to understanding changes in demand for skill. So I think one of the key things is that we need to have a better understanding of the technological changes, because in many respects, the green transition is a technological change. It's the introduction of a whole range of technologies which will bring about sustainability, which will allow waste to be processed in a more sophisticated way. It's about using new materials which will allow things not to become obsolete quite so quickly, and so on and so forth. So we do need to understand the specific technological changes which are taking place, which often we will need to do at a sectoral level rather than at a general level. We also need to understand what's the impact of regulatory change. There is regulatory developments both at European level, but also at national levels, and we need to fully understand what are the implications of that for the demand for skills within a lot of existing jobs, as well as trying to capture what are the new emerging skills. It's also need to be conscious of the response to various environmental cataclysms. I think we're only beginning to observe what are the impacts of aridity, water shortages, and that's going to affect Europe as well as countries in hotter areas of the world. And we also need to understand what are the skill needs which are likely to emerge from consumer tastes, given that there is some evidence, a Eurobarometer quite some time ago, which said, which demonstrated that sometimes consumers are a little resistant to some green changes. And obviously that has, where it impacts upon price, which potentially then has implications for the speed with which change takes place. And as I say, we want to have a good conceptual understanding of how all these feed through into employment, ultimately into the demand for skills. And as I say, a lot of the evidence suggests that the impact on overall employment levels is quite modest, probably neutral, but I think our deep suspicion from a lot of the detailed sectoral work that's gone on is that in some sectors, the impact of all of these can actually be quite substantial on its potential to change the content, the skill content of jobs, which my contention is where we need to focus much more attention in the future. As I say, some of these impacts will be quite large in some sectors. And earlier Giuseppe was making reference to the bioeconomy, and I think the study we were involved with Giuseppe on the bioeconomy suggests that in some areas of the bioeconomy there are very significant changes taking place, which are likely to have major implications for both higher education and vocational education. It doesn't happen everywhere, but there are clearly key hotspots. And it's those hotspots, it's those specific areas which arguably are the real drivers of the green transition across Europe. So how can we better understand what that skilled content is? Well, I think today there are a lot of studies which have taken a very general view that we want to know what is the impact on employment across Europe. What are the key skill demands across all sectors and across all occupations? And these studies are often important because they give you a sense of scale, and scale is important. You need to know how many jobs are affected. You need to know how many people will potentially need upskilling and reskilling. So again, that's important. But I think where we need potentially to devote a lot more research activity is is actually beginning to conduct those sector studies, those occupational studies, where we can look at how occupational change, how technological change, consumer preferences, regulatory change are actually impacting upon jobs now and likely to do so in the future. It's obtaining that degree of granularity in understanding what those changes are and how they will develop in the future. And this is just an example of research I've been involved in, which draws on the bioeconomy study Giuseppe mentioned in his presentation. And this is really just where we're looking at very specific sectors, and we're trying to use a very wide range of information drawn from big data analysis, but also from other sources of data as well, to begin to identify specific subsectors, the jobs within those. So we identify specific subsectors that, as I said earlier, are critical to achieving that green transition. We can begin to look at the jobs which are in those subsectors and understand what is the current combination of skills which are required to do those jobs, and how do we expect those jobs to change in the future, given what we know about technologies and how big data analysis, for example, can provide information which links skills directly to specific technologies. And I think it's increasingly this line of very detailed forensic research, which is undertaken, I think, within a wider framework, which is looking at general trends across sectors, across countries, and which are concerned with giving some sort of, the scale effect, which I said is important, which is vitally important, which provides the comprehensive set of technical and generic skill sets which you will require in key green sectors of the economy. And that provides the detailed information which allows, let's say, critically training providers to actually begin to anticipate skill change over the short to medium term and begin to develop the responses to that. And I think this is there are a lot of Erasmus projects which have adopted a similar sort of approach. But I think it's this level of granularity which is now beginning, I think, to pay some real dividends in providing the type of information which, let's say, policymakers and training providers can actually use. Whereas I think a lot of the more generic information that we've produced in the past, I think, is much more difficult. If you're a policymaker or you're an educational planner, I think that information is a lot more difficult to actually interpret when you're thinking about, well, what do I do to develop a program? What do I do to develop a course? So I think if I was looking back over the past 15 years, I think we've come a long way. I think data science provides an enormous amount of potential, but I think we need to do more to develop the conceptual framework and apply the techniques which are available to us to provide that granular assessment and critically begin to identify where we think mismatches might occur, where we think, well, not mismatches, where shortages are likely to emerge. And to do that, we need a very wide range of information, including that from employers. But anyway, that's a sort of quick tour to the horizon of where I think we've got to over the past 15 years or so. And I think the prospects are really quite exciting for the future in how we use these techniques to get a much better understanding of what we mean by a green job or a green skill. But I'll stop there, and thank you very much for listening.